All right, Dr. Whyte, thanks so much for joining us today. Let's talk about allergies because it seems like every year everybody kind of says the same thing. It's worse this year than it's ever been before. So I'm curious if there's, for one, any truth behind that. And then also, as of right now, like early March, what's happening? What's out there? What's bothering our senses?
And there is truth that allergy season can be worse certain years. And that's because typically what's happening with rain, what's happening with wind, the pollen count. So it's not in your head. Some years are worse than others. The other interesting thing about allergies is we call them seasonal allergies because there are different allergies at different times of year. So now we're approaching the spring. And the allergies that we are most concerned about at this type of season from winter to spring is pollen, right? Flowers are starting to bloom. So one of those pollen counts are going to get higher. We're also going to start seeing some mold allergies as well coming out of the winter months into spring. Those are the two main allergies that I'm going to start seeing in my practice. And I've actually started to see right now.
So different parts of the country, I assume, are experiencing different things right now too. Like I am in Charleston, South Carolina right
Mhm.
now, and there's like a thin yellow layer over everything.
Yeah.
Is that what is that?
Absolutely. And it's this change of weather that we see changes in allergy symptoms. And that kind of yellow powder sometimes that we see in the morning really is pollen, right? That's what we're starting to see from the great aspect of flowers starting to bloom in the spring. And that's going to get people sneezing and coughing and itchy eyes.
Does it cause headaches too?
It can cause headaches because what we're having is your body's responding to the allergens, right? And they view it as something that they have to defend themselves against. And we release all these different types of cells. And sometimes that can cause fluid. And when we get fluid in our sinuses, we get them in certain parts of our body, that can cause some tension and some headache. And that's what we sometimes see with allergies. Not a very common symptom, but one that does exist.
Hmm. And you may not know the answer to this, but I'm curious, and that's fine. Weather-wise, some people say that rain makes it better, rain
Yeah.
makes it worse. Do you have any idea if weather day to day impacts what's going on with the pollen?
The impact of rain on allergies is a great lesson in science because if you think about what's happening in rain, right, that's going to keep pollen counts down, right? Because the barometric pressure, the impact of the rain, we're not going to see a lot of pollen. You never do right after it rains. So pollen allergies are going to go down around rainy days. But you know what can potentially increase mold allergies because damp, cool areas, dark areas, with which you often see with rain, is potentially going to increase mold. So it all depends what you're suffering from, whether you're going to see improvements on rainy days or potentially more challenges with rainy days.
Any tips to treat allergies? I have an air purifier in my house. Is
Mhm.
that helping at all, or is that just kind of for
Yeah.
show?
I always tell patients, and my own children have allergies, you got to be proactive. So you reduce the amount of suffering that you're having. And part of it is knowing what the weather is, right? And preparing for it. The other aspect is really starting to take some medications prior to developing the symptoms when you know it's a bad pollen count day, because that's going to help you. These other things such as air purifiers, I think they can help a little. Certainly when it gets in the warm days outside, people think they keep the windows open. That's good, a lot of fresh air, but sometimes that can bring pollen in. So sometimes you need to keep the windows closed and use your air conditioning. So it's really a little bit of trial and error. But I'll tell you, they're not a substitute for medications when you have serious allergies, because you really want to combat what the body's mechanism is trying to defend itself.
All right. A big buzz
Mhm.
recently is using local honey to treat
Yeah.
allergies. I'm curious, as a medical doctor,
Mhm.
what your thoughts are on that.
Honey is a big buzz, as you point out, no pun intended. And in theory, it sounds like that might work, right? Because bees and honey and pollen, they're all connected. So if I start using honey, maybe I'm going to desensitize myself to these pollen allergies. Kind of makes sense, right? That's what we try to do when we desensitize people, we expose them to an allergen. But the problem with honey is, first of all, the pollen that we're allergic to is different than the pollen that bees are using in honey. And bees have a whole mechanism once they, work with pollen to make honey, right? They digest it, they use enzymes. So it's not the same. In theory, it sounds like a good idea, but there's really no science to back it up.
Gotcha. So does anything we eat matter? If we eliminate certain things from our diet, are we less likely to have seasonal allergy
Mhm.
reactions?
Food allergies are completely different than seasonal allergies. And there's been some research into, can food impact your seasonal allergies? We really haven't seen much data. The key really is to try to avoid the allergens as best as you can. So sometimes that means staying inside. It might mean wearing a mask when you go outside to protect yourself against these allergens. It could be using your air conditioning. And then it's using medication when you need it to really stabilize these cells that are mounting this immune response that in many ways they're overreacting. And then you're starting to have, some of the challenges.
Yeah, I've heard like Instagram doctors talk about
Mhm.
histamine inducing foods like red wine. Is there any
Yeah.
scientific backing to that? Can you wake up stuffed up because you had red wine the night before?
I am always careful on what I read on Instagram when it relates to medical advice, as well as what I post
What?
on Instagram, because in general, it tends to be pretty brief. Let's just be realistic that, if wine was going to impact allergies, we would see it by now. There's no magic pill, there's no magic solution. Seasonal allergies can be very challenging. Certainly for some people, they need to see an immunologist and talk about desensitization. But food really isn't one of the effective ways to try to address seasonal allergies.
Well, I like the answer to that. So I can keep drinking the red wine, is what you're saying.
I didn't say that. That's a totally separate issue. I'm talking about its
Got
relation
it, got it.
to
All right,
allergies.
any other tips to kind of battle the seasonal allergies and make it through until the next round comes in?
Yeah. I think as we discussed, is trying to avoid the allergens as best as you can. That can be difficult. It's having those medications on hand, which are those antihistamines, particularly newer agents. And by that, I mean there was Allegra, there was Claritin, there was Zyrtec. What doesn't work well is Benadryl. And some people are still taking Benadryl. Much older medication isn't what we call a selective medication to address those cells that are causing the immune response. Having medications like some of these inhalers that are steroids or Flonase, because that works on a different mechanism. Things like Mucinex and decongestants usually aren't that effective for allergies, and sometimes there's some confusion on that. It can help with cough, but decongestants in general don't work on the mechanism of action that's going to help address allergies.